17 commercial truck trailers, 8 feet wide, 40 feet long, bolted together in the shape of an H on a patch of asphalt in Jackson Township, New Jersey. No foundation poured, no building permit filed, no certificate of occupancy issued, no sprinkler system, no smoke detectors, no emergency lighting. The corporation that owned them sprayed the outside with polyurethane foam, sculpted it to look like stone, and painted it gray. They called it a castle. Between 1979 and 1984, hundreds of thousands of teenagers walked into that castle in the dark. On the evening of May 11, 1984, 8 of them didn't walk out. Their bodies were found 25 feet from an exit door, burned so severely that the firefighters who discovered them believed they were stepping over melted wax mannequins from the displays. It took hours for anyone to realize they were looking at children. The haunted castle at Six Flags Great Adventure started as a test. In the fall of 1978, park management needed a cheap way to fill seats during the shoulder season, that dead financial stretch between the last sweaty weekend of August and the winter shutdown when the turnstiles barely moved. The solution arrived on wheels: 4 commercial semi-trailers, leased from a seasonal haunted house contractor named George Mahana out of Toms River. The trailers came preloaded with plywood partitions, wax mannequins, and fog machines. A wooden facade went up over the entrance, shutters, stucco planters, a wrought iron gate, and the attraction opened as the Haunted House. It was supposed to run for a few weeks after dark. The lines never stopped. Management extended hours from dusk to all-day operation, and by the end of the season, the cheapest attraction on the property was also its most profitable. For 1979, the original trailers shipped to Missouri. In their place, 17 interconnected semi-trailers assembled into a sprawling H configuration across the midway from the Music Express. Over this aluminum chassis, construction crews erected a wooden framework and coated it in sprayed polyurethane foam, sculpted and painted to simulate the turrets and archways of a medieval fortress. From the midway, it looked like stone. The facade was convincing enough that nobody standing in the queue thought they were about to walk into a shipping container. The 17 trailers were subdivided by plywood partitions into a labyrinth of narrow, winding corridors, some tightening to 24 inches wide. Total darkness, punctuated only by the blinding staccato of theatrical strobe lights and the faint glow of exit signs behind colored plastic. The walls were padded with polyurethane foam, soft, squishy, almost organic, to keep stumbling teenagers from splitting their heads on raw plywood in the pitch black. Because the strobes frequently failed and entire corridors went dark, an unwritten tradition emerged. Teenagers navigated by the open flame of disposable cigarette lighters, the metallic flick of a Bic echoing through the dark between the recorded screams. Employees reported it constantly. Nobody stopped them. The air inside the windowless metal boxes was oppressively humid in summer, cycled only by massive 3-ton air conditioning units bolted to the exterior of each trailer, their mechanical roar vibrating through the aluminum walls and the plywood floors underfoot. The smell was raw lumber, chemical fog fluid, and the damp musk of hundreds of sweating teenagers packed into an aluminum corridor on a July afternoon. Recorded shrieks blasted from ceiling-mounted speakers. Live actors, park employees pulled from clown duties, lurked behind blind corners. Wax figures populated the static sets: a rat lady, a spider room, a hunchback frozen mid-lunge. The haunted castle became a rite of passage. In the early 1980s, at the height of the American slasher film era, busloads of teenagers from New York and Philadelphia made the pilgrimage to Jackson Township specifically for the bragging rights. It was the most immersive horror experience a teenager in either metro area could buy for the price of park admission. The attraction printed money, and the foam that lined the walls, the soft padding teenagers dragged their fingers across in the darkness, the material that kept them safe from bruises, was unrated, untreated polyurethane. When it burns, it doesn't smolder. It flashes into liquid fire and releases gases that kill faster than the flames do. For 5 years, that didn't matter. The haunted castle was owned by a slot machine company. Six Flags Great Adventure had opened in 1974 under the creative direction of Warner Leroy, a New York restaurateur who envisioned a $10 million, roughly $62 million today, fantasy complex across 500 acres of the Pine Barrens. By 1977, the financial burden of that vision forced a sale to Penn Central Corporation, the parent of Six Flags. By 1982, the entire Six Flags chain had been absorbed by Bally Manufacturing for $147.4 million, approximately $465 million in current dollars. Bally built slot machines, pinball tables, and casino equipment. Their corporate culture was rooted in the mathematics of gaming floors: high volume, fast turnover, maximum revenue extracted from every square foot of occupied space. Under Bally, park management operated on a single principle: minimize cost, maximize throughput. Every attraction was a line item. The Haunted Castle was the purest expression of that thinking. The entire structure cost a fraction of a single steel roller coaster. The trailers were leased. The interior was commodity plywood and surplus foam. Staffing was a skeleton crew: a handful of minimum wage actors, a single roving interior monitor, and exterior gatekeepers managing the queue. Revenue flowed upward continuously. Reinvestment in the structure's safety or integrity was functionally zero. The mechanism that made this possible was a single word: temporary. Because the trailers sat on their original wheel chassis, because they could theoretically be unbolted and driven down a highway, park management classified the sprawling, year-round, 17-trailer complex as a temporary structure. Jackson Township accepted the classification without challenge. Under the New Jersey Uniform Construction Code, a permanent building designed to hold crowds in darkness required architectural plan review, fire-rated construction materials, automatic sprinkler systems, hardwired smoke detection, and emergency egress lighting. Retrofitting 17 interconnected aluminum trailers with those systems would have cost tens of thousands of dollars in engineering and installation, plus ongoing annual maintenance. But the structure was temporary. A word on a form said so. None of those requirements applied. No building permit was ever filed. No certificate of occupancy was ever requested. The question of who was responsible for inspecting the Haunted Castle had no answer. The Department of Labor inspected mechanical rides, and this had no mechanical parts. The township enforced building codes on permanent structures, and this wasn't classified as one. The attraction sat in a jurisdictional void where no government authority felt empowered or obligated to enforce life safety standards on a facility that regularly held hundreds of people in pitch darkness inside aluminum boxes lined with flammable foam. Because no authority was watching, the failures accumulated without interference. In 1979, when the expanded complex first opened, the park installed smoke detectors inside the maze. They worked exactly as designed, which became the problem. The detectors triggered constantly, set off by theatrical fog, summer humidity, and teenagers who pulled at them for entertainment. Rather than invest in commercial-grade sensors calibrated for the environment, management disconnected the system entirely. Automated detection was replaced by a single roving employee tasked with walking the dark corridors and sniffing for smoke. The following year, the park's own independently retained safety consultant delivered a comprehensive fire risk evaluation. The report identified 10 specific upgrades needed to mitigate the danger. 9 out of 10 sounds like a passing grade. Management completed 9. Minor fixes, low-cost adjustments, the kind of items that fill a compliance binder and suggest diligence. The 10th recommendation was the installation of an automatic fire sprinkler system. Management reviewed the cost, reviewed the engineering difficulty of plumbing pressurized water into mobile trailers, and vetoed it. The single system capable of suppressing a polyurethane flashover was the single system they refused to fund. In 1982, Bally's $147.4 million acquisition of Six Flags flooded the brand with corporate capital. New rides were commissioned across the chain. Marketing budgets expanded. The Haunted Castle, the park's cheapest, highest-margin attraction, received none of it. The foam stayed. The plywood stayed. The absent sprinklers stayed. In 1983, Jackson Township Fire Inspector David Van Arsdale Jr. conducted an official walkthrough of the 17-trailer complex and filed his report. 0 violations. The trailers were temporary. The building code didn't apply. The inspection handed management bureaucratic validation to continue operating exactly as they had been, and the justification to shelve their own consultants' recommendations indefinitely. In the final days before the fire, the Haunted Castle's day manager broke ranks. He filed a catalog of deteriorating conditions directly to park management. Exit sign bulbs burned out, panic hardware on emergency doors failing, raw polyurethane foam exposed where vinyl wall coverings had torn away, and the lighter flames that had been tolerated for 5 years still flickering through dead corridors. No repairs were authorized. No operational changes were made. On the morning of May 11, 1984, a primary theatrical strobe light in the corridor adjacent to the Hunchback display failed and was not replaced. The corridor went completely dark. The machine was loaded. Friday evening, May 11, 1984. Attendance at Great Adventure was light, so park management sealed off one entire wing of the H configuration and routed all traffic through a single 9-trailer loop. At approximately 6:30 p.m., around 29 people were inside the operating maze, mostly teenagers, plus 4 employees. At 6:35, a 14-year-old boy was guiding a 13-year-old he'd just met at the entrance through the corridor where the strobe had died, a 24-inch wide passage in absolute blackness. The boy pulled out a cigarette lighter. He stumbled. The open flame made contact with a section of wall where the vinyl covering had torn away, exposing the raw polyurethane foam underneath. The chemistry was instantaneous. The foam didn't smolder, it flashed, vaporizing into liquid fire that raced up the wall and across the untreated plywood ceiling in seconds. The massive 3-ton air conditioning units mounted to the trailer exteriors were still running at full power, pumping industrial volumes of oxygen through the corridors. The fire didn't drift through the maze. It was force-fed, driven by mechanical airflow down the 24-inch corridors like flame through a blast furnace. In 3.5 minutes, the enclosed space reached flashover. Every combustible surface in the trailer ignited simultaneously. The burning polyurethane released a wall of thick, oily black smoke saturated with carbon monoxide, hydrogen cyanide, and phosgene, a poison gas deployed in the trenches of World War I. The gases moved faster than the visible flames and were lethal in concentrations far below what filled those corridors. An employee smelled smoke and dismissed it. Patrons sneaking cigarettes was routine. When the smoke thickened, he abandoned the maze and sprinted to the control room. Because the automated alarms had been disconnected years earlier, a critical delay opened between ignition and the first distress call to Jackson Township Fire Dispatch. 14 people fought their way back toward the entrance in the blinding dark, slamming off plywood walls, screaming through the poison air. A witness from a trailing group saw flames cresting the Hunchback display and assumed it was a new theatrical effect. She didn't understand what was happening until the chemical stench closed her throat. Deep inside the loop, 9 teenagers from Brooklyn were trapped. The maze designed to disorient them performed exactly as built. The toxic gases dropped them to the plywood floor in the pitch black. A park employee found the group and physically dragged one survivor out of the smoke. Joseph Bayrowdy, Nicola Caiazza, Jose Carrion, Luan Dawson, Christopher Harrison, Eric Rodriguez, Lenny Ruiz, Samuel Valentine, ages 15 to 19. They died where they fell. Carbon monoxide poisoning and smoke inhalation. Jackson Township fire units arrived to flames leaping 100 feet into the night sky, the aluminum trailer shells melting inward on themselves. Park staff told Fire Chief Quebec that everyone had successfully evacuated. Firefighters attempted an interior attack, but the flooring at the main entrance collapsed, forcing a defensive strategy. Crews used circular saws to cut directly through the corrugated aluminum walls and pour water into the wreckage. By 7:45, the fire was declared under control. During the secondary search, crews found the 8 teenagers clustered together, 25 feet from a fully functional emergency exit door they never saw and never reached. The first responders who discovered them initially logged the finding as destroyed wax mannequins. The heat had been so extreme and the environment so saturated with melted synthetic props that the distinction between a teenage victim and a theatrical display was completely erased. Confirmation came hours later. The amusement park remained open while the attraction burned. The gates closed only after the full death count was confirmed that evening. On September 14, 1984, an Ocean County grand jury returned an unprecedented indictment. Six Flags Great Adventure and its corporate parent were charged with aggravated manslaughter, recklessly causing death under circumstances manifesting extreme indifference to human life. Park executives Larry Cochran and his predecessor David Paltzik were indicted individually. The 8-week criminal trial became a test case in American corporate liability for homicide. The prosecution laid out the full inventory: no building permits, deliberately disconnected smoke detectors, a safety consultant's sprinkler recommendation vetoed on cost grounds, lethal unrated materials, and a final week of ignored warnings from the attraction's own day manager. The defense executed 3 arguments. Every one of them landed. First, arson. A 14-year-old patron had deliberately produced an open flame inside the attraction. The ignition was a criminal act by a visitor, not a foreseeable output of corporate operations. The fact that employees had documented the lighter habit for years, that management knew teenagers were lighting flames inside a foam-lined plywood box and chose not to confiscate lighters at the door, was reframed as irrelevant to the question of corporate recklessness. Second, regulatory compliance. The township's own inspector had walked through the haunted castle in 1983 and documented 0 violations. If the government certified the structure as compliant, the corporation could not have been operating with reckless indifference. The word temporary had saved the corporation money on construction. Now it saved them in court. Third, Chester Schirmer. At the time of the trial, Schirmer held 2 positions simultaneously: chair of the National Fire Protection Association's Technical Committee on Automatic Sprinklers and chair of the NFPA's Board of Directors. The defense hired him as their expert witness. Schirmer sat in a courtroom facing the families of 8 dead teenagers and testified under oath that an automatic sprinkler system would not have saved their children's lives. The flashover of the polyurethane foam, he claimed, was too rapid for any suppression system to counteract. He went further. He testified that shouting, "Fire!" was more effective than automated smoke alarms, on the grounds that human noses and eyes were the best detection systems available, and that alarm signals might be misinterpreted by disoriented patrons in a dark attraction. The chair of the National Sprinkler Committee testified against sprinklers. Newark Fire Chief John Caulfield said publicly that Schirmer had set back the cause of sprinklers at least 25 years. The NFPA board investigated his conflict of interest and concluded he had failed to appreciate the sensational media event created by his dual roles. He retained his position as chair of the Sprinkler Committee until 1997. After 13 hours of deliberation, the jury acquitted Six Flags and its parent corporation on all criminal charges. The foreman stated publicly that Jackson Township bore the moral responsibility for permitting the regulatory loophole to exist. Cochran and Paltzik never went to trial. Both entered pre-trial intervention programs, completed community service, and walked away with no criminal record and no prison time. Civil litigation produced a different outcome. 7 of the 8 victims' families settled with Bally Manufacturing for $2.5 million each, approximately $7.3 million per family today. The 8th family rejected the settlement and took their case to a jury. The jury awarded $750,000, less than a third of what the other families received. Within days of the fire, while the legal machinery was still in its earliest stages, the state of New Jersey ordered multiple walk-through dark attractions shut down statewide pending emergency inspection. Among them was a trailer-based haunted house on Casino Pier in Seaside Heights, also constructed by George Mahana's Toms River Haunted House Company. A state investigative panel concluded the regulatory system had failed at every level, and that the haunted castle had violated at least a dozen existing fire codes that no authority had enforced. In 1988, the NFPA published a comprehensive revision to its life safety code. For the first time, a classification called special amusement buildings was codified into national regulation. The code mandated that any structure designed to disorient occupants, reduce visibility, or impede foot traffic must be equipped with automatic sprinkler systems, hardwired smoke detection linked to alarm systems, and emergency lighting that activates the moment an alarm triggers, regardless of whether the structure sits on a permanent foundation or a set of trailer wheels. The word temporary no longer provided shelter. Six Flags spent $5.2 million, roughly $15.2 million today, retrofitting Great Adventure with sprinklers and computerized safety monitoring. Attendance dropped 15% in the year following the fire. The charred trailers were hauled away. The asphalt was repaved. no memorial was placed. The footprint of the haunted castle was absorbed back into the operating park, eventually occupied by subsequent attractions built to code, inspected on schedule, and equipped with every system the original structure lacked. Most visitors walk over the ground without knowing. Every walk-through haunted attraction operating legally in America today, every escape room, every Halloween maze, every dark ride, carries the safety infrastructure that 8 teenagers from Brooklyn paid for with their lives on a Friday evening in May. If you grew up in Jersey in the early 80s, you may have stood in that queue line. You may have felt the foam under your fingers in the dark. You may have flicked a lighter. If you remember the haunted castle, or if you remember the night the news broke, drop it in the comments. If you want the real stories behind the places that shaped American childhood, subscribe.